This is our new improved hood design. You're going to start with your nylon pieces and your mesh pieces for the hood. So the curved edge of both, you can do a straight stitch or a serged edge. I've got 3 sets of hoods here, so I'm going to show you how these go together. First of all, we'll add the casing to the draw cord, fold in an end about 1 inch or 1.5 inches, lay the draw cord in the center and fold it over, and then baste that in place about 1/4 inch from the raw edges. This is an industrial machine, but a regular home sewing machine will work as well. I like to, when I'm sewing these, put a little tension on the fabric up in front and behind to keep it straight so it doesn't pucker. At the other end, fold in a little edge for a clean finished edge, 1 inch or 1.5 inches. Okay, now a technique that I use often when doing multiples of any project is called chaining off. Quilters use this a lot. What that means is when you get to the end of one seam, you don't lift your foot and cut the threads, you just keep going. And you end up with a bunch of pieces in a long chain. Then when you're done with your chain, you just trim in between the pieces, and you don't have all the tails, all the thread tails to trim off. You just have one at the beginning. So if that's helpful to you, I highly recommend it. Something else you can do if you'd like is use pins to pin this in place first and then sew it. It's entirely up to you. Once that casing has been sewn, you're going to fold it in half, line up the 2 ends of the casing to find the center, and make a clip in the seam allowance to mark the middle. And you can use that middle to line up right sides with the nylon part of your hood. This is another thing you can pin if you like pins, or you can just line it up and baste it on. So I'm going to sew pretty much over the basting stitches that I just did, and they'll be enclosed in the seam in just a minute. This is another great opportunity to use chaining off. In this case, all I would do is sew straight off the end of the fabric and onto the next one. Get my next casing ready. Line it up. And sew it on. And so forth till you get to the end of your stack. Next, I'm going to attach the mesh over the top of the drawstring casing, so right sides together, match that center seam, Use a pin if you'd like. And quite often the mesh and the nylon don't end up the same length because the mesh has some stretch in it. So if that's the case when you're working on it, no worries. It will all work out in the end. Okay, so after I pin this to the casing, I need to get the tail of the draw cord out. So slide the draw cord down, the cord lock I should say, slide the cord lock down till it's about an inch from the bottom of the casing on both ends. That one looks good. And then you want the end of your elastic sticking out when you do this seam. So I'm going to put a pin on both sides of that to hold it in place. And we'll make that about an inch below the casing. Now, sewing machines do not like rubber. So when you sew this, I'm going to sew with the mesh side down so that the mesh gets pulled through with my feed dogs. I'm going to sew just inside my basting stitch. And when I get to this elastic, I'm going to back stitch, skip across the elastic, back stitch, and then continue on around the front of the hood. And that way your machine won't get all messed up trying to go through that rubber. Okay, same thing on this end. I go up to the elastic, back stitch, skip across the elastic, back stitch, and then finish that. And then I would continue with my next one and chain off again. To anchor the ends of this draw cord in place, I'm going to use a wide satin stitch on the seam allowance. So I've got the mesh is still folded backwards. I'm going to center that cord in the middle of the foot and then just sew that something like that. You may have to help it through the machine a little bit. And I don't think it matters whether you do it facing that way or this way. Just center it under there and sew a little bar tack across there. Then the last thing you'll do is tie an overhand knot on the end of this draw cord. Pull it nice and tight. And it will not come out. I found out it is very, very secure. If this tail is long, you can trim it off to about a ½ inch. So here's the other side, bar tacked with a knot in it and trimmed off. That's what you want it to look like when you're finished with this step. Okay, I'm back to my straight stitch machine. I like this machine just because it goes really fast. Okay, you're going to flip your hood right side out. Tuck the mesh to the inside of the hood. Then with mesh side down again, I'm going to do a top stitch. About a ½ inch from the folded edge of that seam you did. Now I'm going to do the same thing here that I did when I was sewing that seam. I'm going to sew up to the elastic and the draw cord, back stitch, skip across it, back stitch, and then continue on with my top stitching. That way your machine will like you. Now if you've kept your knot back past the seam allowance, it shouldn't get in your way while you're doing this top stitching. And then once again I would chain off. You can see on here my top stitching didn't stay quite straight. I think that knot was probably a little bit in the way for me, but we're not after perfection, so as long as it's reasonable, don't unpick it. Final step for the hood is to baste the bottom edge of the mesh and the hood together. If you have a serger, you can serge that in one step. Match up the center back seams. This is another place that the mesh and the nylon don't always come out even. So if it doesn't, just pucker that mesh right in there. And we've adjusted the pattern since this was cut out. This little loop here is not necessary on our jacket, so if you're serging this, you can cut it straight off. And once again, here's another place I love to chain off, so I don't have to trim off those thread tails. So the bottom finished edge should be fairly straight like this. If you do not have a serger, you can trim off the edges so they're even and zigzag, and that works just as well. Using the same technique, put the mesh on the bottom. It helps it to ease in if it's not quite the same size as the nylon, and pucker it in if you need to, if it doesn't fit exactly. And there's the hood.